Hello, everyone. Today, I just wanted to have a little conversation before I begin reading today. If any of the people watching, feels that you aren't safe at home or safe out in public, don't be afraid to ask someone. Don't be afraid to call someone. Anything that might happen could easily be stopped with a single phone call. But that's my small little PSA to keep yourself safe. Let's get into the book today. This will be episode 3 of Bendy and the Lost Ones. And I did not get any song requests. So, I am going to put on some calm music that hopefully YouTube will not copyright me for, and we'll just have it play in the background. So, apologies for taking so long. It's been a bit of a day, but I hope everyone else's day has been going good. And, well, yeah. Alright. Hopefully YouTube won't copyright me, but we never know. Alright. So, to resume back, we are on Chapter 6, Bill. Let me turn this down real quick. Alright. The dining room was a shining bright space, so unlike its character from this morning. I leaned against the doorframe to the butler's pantry and stared at the delicate crystal glasses. The faucets, each with their own little glint dancing around their faces. At the silverware, newly polished. The fine china. The candles lit in their silver holders. The lights in the chandelier above bright and welcoming. And I thought to myself, the room was not made for the people who live here. This room was made for the people who visit. How pathetic. You ready, son? My father had a way of bursting into the room like an infamous bull in a china shop. The glasses on the table positively shook with fear. I sighed. Of course he was ready, when I was never ready. Yes, father, I replied. Good. How does it look? Does it look expensive? Father asked, walking to the table, examining it closely. He found an invisible spot on a knife and spat on it, giving it a rub and then with the sleeve of his perfectly tailored suit jacket. Father, you can't do that, I said. I motioned to one of the servants, who had placed a giant floral arrangement on the sideboard. He nodded immediately and swooped in. Somehow, very politely, took the knife from my father's meaty grasp. It looks expensive, though, he said, turning to me. All day it had nothing but question after question. My father was trying to make sure everything was perfect for the fear of what others might think. I really wished Mother was still alive for the moments like these. She had a magical calming effect on him, on all of us. She put things into perspective. Neither father nor I was particularly good at putting things into perspective. Yes, it does, I replied. Fancy, right? He turned back to the table and put his hands on his hips. He seemed pleased. Very fancy. He turned and grinned at me. The way New York likes it. Just that way. It was never names with any of them. It was always places. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia. These men self-identified so hard with their cities, it was as if they had built them from the ground up. Ironic, since most of them had come to America not so long ago. All of us were newcomers in a way. And if we didn't think it, then we were reminded by it of others. The others who didn't call themselves by city names, but by their own last names. Last names were meant to suggest a more deeply rooted performance than cities themselves. Old money. All of it was for show. All of it was exhausting. I didn't want a part of it, yet here I was, suddenly sitting at a table with a dozen or so men just like my father. Loud, hungry for something more than just a steak at apologies everyone. Hungry for something more than just a steak at the table, and rich. So very rich. I'd played this part, attending so many of these dinners, that I didn't even notice how we went from moment to moment, how I ended up eating a bloody steak when I'd only just been standing watching my father spit on a knife. Soon dessert would happen. Had happened. Then expensive whiskey or brandy for my father and his guests. Oh, that happened too. Then what? Then suddenly, after standing in some nightclub on the boardwalk or an elegant bar in the hotel, surrounded by noise and uncontrolled laughter, that messy drunken behavior that wasn't quite dangerous enough to break out into a fight, but not so safe as to offer a teasing joke without causing deep offense. Now, it wasn't a future possibility. Now I was here at the Rose Club. That was a fancy joint. My father had really pulled out all the stops with this visit. In my very sober state, I realized only that this visit was a big deal for my father. As in, an actual big deal. My father only brought guests to the club if he engaged in a deal that would have a huge effect on his income and, more importantly, his power in Atlantic City. I hadn't been paying any attention. Now I regretted it. I was adrift, and I had no idea what was going on. This happened to me sometimes. I slipped in and out. I remembered trying to explain to father as a child this feeling of losing moments. He couldn't grasp the concept and had no desire to try harder. Mother had just died, and he hardly had room for his own thoughts. I didn't blame him. But if he understood, I'd feel back then. I might be able to actually help him too. Help him skip past the scary things, the frustrating things, and just focus on what they needed to be done. It was scary after Mother died. What do we do with her now? Without her now? How do we live our lives without her support? Best to ignore these questions. My life returned to a more regular pace, and I was brought back to reality as I was handed a glass of champagne. "He's 17!" A man with a thick New York accent laughed. Not really concerned with my moral character, just enjoying the moment. "Champagne doesn't count," giggled his date, a short, freckled redhead woman with a gummy smile. "It's Atlantic City. Nothing ever counts here," added another fellow. "Except Emmett's steak," said the New York accented man. They all laughed heartily at my father's greed and clinked glasses. I didn't join them, just placed my full champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray. Turned around and stared at the large dance floor. Swirls of color slid across my view as folks danced, the bands on the bandstand behind. It was amazing that, despite the tourist season being long behind us, there were still enough people to fill this room. Still enough folks who needed a drink and a laugh, and a spin on the dance floor. Who needed to escape? What were they running from tonight? What would weigh them down tomorrow morning? Did they see their futures as laid out before them by someone else? Did they wish they could turn into the dirt path and had an adventure or two? Were they trapped? Were they like me? And then all the lights went out. Chapter 7. Constance. "You're coming out with us," announced Chloe, practically ripping her costume off and kicking it to one side. She took in a deep breath, and I didn't blame her. The corsets on the last costume of the night were very tight. I would know. I had to tie them. I shook my head and said, No, thank you. I really couldn't go out tonight, not after the very long day I had. And it was just a Tuesday after all. Why was everyone making a Tuesday so dramatic today? Chloe grabbed my hand and practically yanked my shoulder out of its socket, pulling me towards her. "Makeover time!" No, please no, not makeover time. I hated makeover time. I was pushed unceremonially into a chair in front of one of the mirrors. I looked at a fright. I looked like a fright. It was true. I did enjoy looking presentable, but I hated being dressed up like some doll. This happened every few months, and I had no idea what was wrong with my normal appearance. I looked over at Lily still in front of her mirror. She was already dressed in her regular clothes and carefully reapplying her going out makeup after having removed her performance makeup. She looked at me in the mirror and shrugged. Lily was never going to be my savior. The girls knew I don't fight back. I never did. They enjoyed it too much. And I didn't want to take a fuss. I didn't want to make a fuss no matter how much I disliked their poking and prodding. And of course, the underlying message of how you look isn't quite good enough. I quickly turned into their version of Cinderella at the ball. Dark eyeliner, bold lipstick, even some rouge. And was passed over to Mirabelle, who handed me a black dress with a satin sheet. "Come on, hurry up," she ordered. So I hurried. I looked at myself as I pulled on the dress. I didn't look bad at all. I never had an issue with the end result, but I didn't look like me. I liked the makeup a certain way, a little softer. My clothes a little less showy. It wasn't that I didn't mind looking good. I just thought I already did, except for today. That is, today I had been a complete disaster. Maybe the makeup was warranted, this one time. "Let's go, let's go." Ah, there was Lily's familiar, insistent whine. The order was followed, and soon all of us, including a very exhausted me, were swept out of the hotel and onto the boardwalk in peals of ringing laughter. Chloe linked her arm in mine and gave me a wink. "You're a good sport," she said. I always liked her. She had the reputation of a reputation of a typical fiery redhead, but to me she seemed the most down-to-earth of any of the girls in the chorus. "I'm a pushover," I replied. I was able to be a bit more honest with her than the most. "You should work on that," she replied. I nodded. She was right, but I didn't know where to start. I couldn't get past the notion that it was best to keep it all inside. My sisters could be outgoing and share everything they thought and felt because it was safe to. Molly was so lovely, though, through and through. And Lily was harmless and silly, even in her demanding ways. But the real me, the inside me, I was certain no one wanted to see that. To see my frustration, to see what I really thought of the world and those in it. No one would understand. It wouldn't work. To thine out myself be true. To thine own self be true. Shakespeare wrote that. But Shakespeare hadn't been a girl. We turned down the street, falling behind the others, towards a red flashing sign that read, "The Rose Club." It might have looked like a dive from the outside, but it was one of the higher-end clubs in Atlantic City, and expensive. "Don't worry," said Chloe as we walked down the short flight of stairs to the entrance. "Some swell is paying for all of us girls. Silly fellow." Silly indeed, if he thought paying for these girls meant he'd get anything special in return. They weren't stupid. These ladies, they knew how to handle these kinds of guys. You could almost feel sorry for them. The way they fawned and spent lavishly with such high unmet hopes. But not really. All I could do was nod. I hated being paid for by anyone, even people with good intentions. I liked not having to rely on anyone. Maybe it was seeing Molly and Lily receive so many gifts over the years, but I didn't want that. I wanted to be self-sufficient. We checked our coats and we were met then by a wall of noise and swirls of color. The place was packed, but like a school of fish. Our group maneuvered together and managed to acquire a corner table on which purses and gloves exploded in a colorful mess. "Do you want a drink?" asked Chloe. "Oh," I replied, feeling appropriately overwhelmed. "I guess a soda pop." Chloe laughed. "I'm going to get you a real drink." I meant to tell her I was too young and honestly not particularly interested in alcohol, but she held up her finger and looked at me intently, so I didn't want to say anything, and she quickly vanished into the crowd. I felt suddenly alone. It was interesting, really, when you thought about it. Here, I was surrounded by so many people, and yet I could go for a walk by myself along the boardwalk and feel perfectly content. Normally, I'd be happy just to observe. That was not my first party, nor my first time in a nightclub. I just liked watching people. I enjoyed seeing happy faces and watching them laugh and dance together. I liked it when life was colorful, when life was pretty, when, just for a little while, cares and worries were set aside. But today felt so different. All day something had been ticking my spine. Tickling. Jeez. I need to work on my reading. I shook my head. It had to have been the dive this morning. I could still feel the wind against my face, feel my stomach turn over, looking down at the water far below me. The inky blackness. Suddenly, all I wanted to do was go home and go to bed and wake up refreshed with a new day of possibilities in front of me. My unfocused gaze landed on a familiar face. The rich kid from earlier. The one I had seen darting around the base of the diving platform. He was standing with a group of large, boisterous men. The kind of men who always laughed out a little too loudly at parties, who never quite finished their drinks but always refilled their glasses. The rich kid looked miserable. My heart went out to him then. We all have our problems. It's all relative. Even those who live in palaces have days where the walls seem like they're caving in. We're all human after all. I was watching the rich kid closely, wondering about him, who he was, why his father needed to shoot that film of his, when I noticed a different young man walking toward me suddenly. He crossed into the path between me and the rich kid and smiled as he did. He was quite handsome. I observed dark hair, parted neatly, a perfectly cut suit, dimple on one cheek. It didn't occur to me that he was walking towards me until he started talking and said, eyes meeting across a crowded room. I stared at him. He seemed suddenly very close, like he had just materialized right in front of me then, hand outstretched. What? I said. It was the wrong thing to say, but when did I ever manage to say the right thing? The young man laughed. I saw you looking at me. I must say, I've never been more flattered. I just stared at him. As his deep brown eyes, the slight crinkle at the edges, he was amused by me. Oh, how I disliked amusing people like this. People either thought I was rude or amusing. I always was an object of some kind of fascination, all because I couldn't quite say the words I wanted to say. One ought to. Yet another reason to keep everything myself. Jesus. Yet another reason to just keep everything to myself. No one seemed to understand me. More than that, no one tried to understand me. Oh, well, I said, utterly confused. Then it hit me. Somehow, this man had thought my staring was directed at him. Now my cheeks were definitely burning. Thank goodness the room was overly warm, or he wouldn't have noticed. I'm Andrew, he said. I realized his outstretched hand was for me to take, and I grabbed it awkward. He gave my hand a little shake and released it. I looked at him some more. Truly, he was a good-looking tall. My goodness. Truly, he was a good-looking, tall, slender, but strong. There was something also very pleasing about his presence, almost calming. And? He laughed, and I no longer felt particularly calm. What was I missing? Your name is? He asked. Of course. I wasn't stupid. I knew how introductions worked. Oh, yes, of course. I'm Constance. It's nice to meet you, replied Andrew. Now, I was starting to slowly feel frustrated. He spoke with expectations in his voice, and stood there silently as I was supposed to read his mind. But I honestly was rather confused. I didn't generally get approached by anyone in these situations. Why now? Then I remembered the dress, the makeup, the hair. Oh my goodness. He thought I was staring at him before. This is a boy-girl thing happening now, isn't it? I asked myself, you're not a child. You can do this. It wasn't as if I'd never been on an outing with a boy before, or even kissed one. Once, at one time, oh, how Lily would laugh at me now, my chastel little ways, as she called them. Where was she? Nice to meet you too, though, was it? Was it maybe too stressful, really? Why did I suddenly miss feeling so very alone? How was it I missed that strange dread in my soul and the memory of the cold water dive? Were those feelings better than the flustered confession I was feeling now? Confusion. I think yes. At least I understood the former. The latter was out of my control. Care to dance? Not really. Yes, that would be lovely. So that happened. He took my hand gently. I noticed this time, how soft and warm it was. I noticed how clammy and cold mine were. He must have regretted doing this, but he didn't seem to. He escorted me to the dance floor, and then the other hand was at my waist. That didn't help my flustered feelings, but I focused on the music and the dance steps. I wasn't a bad dancer, after all. We all were quite good at such things, the Grey sisters. Even the one who refused to go into show business, who was happy behind the scenes. Even she, this is to say, even I, enjoyed a good turnabout the room. And how good it was. He was very elegant and sure-footed. He had grace. He was no Fritz Astaire, but who in real life was. I started to feel dizzy. If you look at me, it'll help, he said, clearly noticing. Well, that was a problem now, wasn't it? I was purposely trying not to look at him. Looking at him made me feel very vulnerable, because I rather liked looking at him. I looked at him. He smiled. I smiled. Maybe it's okay to feel flustered sometimes. Maybe it's a good feeling. Maybe it's a really good feeling. I felt myself settle into his arms. Not quite relaxed, but not. It was nice. And then everything went black. Chapter 8. Brand. This isn't what I had in mind when you said you'd get me into the party, I said under my breath. Shh, replied Mike. I shook my head as I stood there listening to the matois de give us instructions on the proper way to pass around drinks and food. Circulate, always circulate, he said in a thick French accent that sounded almost too French. If that guy's French, then I'm a goldfish, I muttered. I said shh. The maitre d' gave us a stern look. Something's wrong. Monsieur Michiel? No, sir, replied Michael, taking a sharp inhale of breath. I snorted that. You have your instructions. Now alt! Said the maitre d' with a clap of his hands. We were hustled over to the staging area. As I picked up a tray, I said, I thought we were going to the party, not working the party. Michael rolled his eyes at me. I said I'd get you in, and you're in. Stop being such a drip. I could have said something then about how Mike was being so much of a drip that he was soaking wet. But I refrained and instead just took the tray with the little cheese puffs on it because I knew for a fact if I was the one with the champagne flutes, then apologies everyone. But I refrained and instead just took the tray with the little cheese puffs on it because I knew for a fact if I was the one with the champagne flutes that it would be all on the floor before I even made it to our guests. We left the small kitchen and entered the glittering party room, complete with the dance floor and the band playing. Looked like a swell party. Would have been fun to be a guest, not a darn waiter. I turned to find Mike to chew him out some more, but he had already vanished into the crowd. Circulate, monsieur, Vuantis. The maitre d' drew a circle with his finger as he hissed the instruction in my ear before swanning off to kiss some partygoers on each cheek. Quite a talent, really, to do all that in just a single motion. Needed good coordination for that. I picked up a cheese puff and popped it into my mouth and decided to make the best of it. So I circulated. And honestly, it turned out to be in fact a pretty excellent excuse to wander through the crowd looking for William Chambers. I'd never tell Mike that. Ooh, puffy cheese! A tall man with very red cheeks suddenly bent his head into my line of vision to examine each little puff. Yeah, I said, as I watched him breathe on everything. I made a small note in my mental notepad never to eat anything that's been circulated ever again. He eventually picked up a little puff right in the middle of everything, his hands grazing a couple as he went in for the kill. Then he was off, and I was still watching his long limbs retreat into the crowd when another hand emerged from beside me. Instinctively I said, "Don't!" then quickly turned to apologize for the outburst. I'm very sorry, it's just that I stopped. I was staring at a bewildered William Chambers. Here he was, right in front of me. I quickly changed my tone from apologetic to conspiratorial. If there was one thing I knew about people, it's that they loved to think they were in on a secret. I lowered my voice, which automatically made him moving closer to hear me. There was a fellow just now. Touched almost all of them. I wouldn't recommend eating one. William looked at me, confused, but didn't say much of anything. Just sort of nodded. He seemed strangely out of sorts. Maybe he was drunk, but it was different. It spooked me a little. I wrote a note in my brain about it. I'd need to, at some point, transpose everything inside my head onto a real piece of paper. Needed to remind myself to do that. I watched as William turned to look elsewhere, his mind seemingly heavily occupied, but I wanted to knock on its door and see if I was allowed in. Are you William Chambers? I asked. Might as well just go for it, I thought. That's when the world went black. I knew immediately what was going on, though. I seemed to be the only one of the only ones. I guess these rich folks weren't Used, yeah, I guess these rich folks weren't as used to blackouts as I was. That's why my uncle would always go on and on about the good old days when you didn't have to rely on electricity and such. Candles, boy oh boy, did he love candles. Folks were getting nervous, and you could tell people were moving about, trying to do something useful, trying not to panic. I knew that if the lights didn't get turned on soon, things would get a lot more manic, likely even dangerous. A large group of drunk revelers trapped down in the basement club in the dark, just as I thought it. I found myself on the floor. Somebody had crashed into me hard. I'm so sorry. Are you alright? I didn't know who was talking to me when I felt a hand on my shoulder and I was helped up. We need to get to the fuse box, the voice said. I can fix this if I could get to the fuse box. I agreed, I replied. It's in the kitchen. I saw it. Come with me. Follow my voice. My body resembled the way back. Remembered the way back. And called out to my new friend to follow. I didn't know if he had been able to get I did not know if he was able to in the dark until we made it inside the kitchen. The gas was still working, so the burners of the stove were still on. It was a small amount of light, but it seemed like a sun compared with the pitch black in the ballroom. Turned to my friend, and that's when I realized it was William. I stared at him as he darted past, looking for the fuse box. This kid was going to save the day? I watched him from a distance, a shadow now, barely an outline, moving about, trying to find a replacement for the fuse, I guessed. He seemed to know what he was doing, and sure enough, suddenly the lights were back on. Just like that. New tactic, not conspiratorial, time for familiarity. That might work. What does a rich kid like you know about fixing things? I asked, approaching him. William closed the door containing the fuses, playing with the spent one in his hand. Have we met before? He asked, looking confused and a little suspicious of me. I smiled and stuck out my hand to shake. Brant Morris. You're William Chambers. I was at the horse diving event this morning. William looked at my hand for a moment and then smiled. He took it. It's Bill. Nice to meet you, Brant. I like fixing things. What can I say? Didn't know things needed fixing in your neck of the woods, I said, leaning against the countertop. Staff were flooding into the kitchen now, and the Monsieur D was already barking orders. But I was determined to have this little conversation with William, or rather, Bill. Things always need fixing, he said. It sounded deep the way he said it, meaningful. Maybe it was. Maybe it was just his way. Everything about him seemed confident. This was a man who knew he was meant to take up space in this world. Maybe he was just meant that objects break and you need to fix them. Right this way, monsieur. I finally turned towards the chaos as Monsieur D came right for us with a man in coveralls behind him. As he approached, I saw a stitched-out name tag that had Scott written on it, and underneath the word gent spelled out in capital letters. It was just a fuse, said Bill, as Scott, the gentleman, passed him, not even giving him a second glance. Nothing just about this system, replied Scott gruffly, opening the mail door and looking inside the small closet-like space. Bill went over to join him. Well, I had to reattach a loose wire here, he said and pointed. You! Get back to work! The Monsieur D grabbed me by my shoulder and whipped around fast at that. You better remove that hand before I snap my cap. The Monsieur D backed away slowly, shooting daggers at me. But it wasn't like I was planning on this work arrangement to be any kind of long-term deal. I was okay with his anger. I had more important things to do, like get this story. I turned in time to see Bill and Scott shaking hands. Not a bad job, kid, said Scott. You ever need a gig? Let me know. Thank you, sir, replied Bill. I couldn't help but laugh. Both of them looked at me confused. Oh, come on. Like this rich kid needs a gig, I said. Scott looked at Bill, then back at me, then shook his head and picked up his tools, and was on his way. The word gent on the back of his coveralls disappearing behind the cooks and waiters. I looked at Bill, and he was staring at me kind of funny. Shoot, I'd miscalculated. I thought maybe he was the kind of guy who was tired of yes-men, who appreciated someone being down-to-earth son of a gun with him. But of course, now that I thought about it, how many rich folks actually appreciated that, especially from a great stranger? Hey, I said, making to apologize. Look, you want to grab a drink? Said Bill, interrupting. Oh, or maybe I was right on the money. Right on the big stinking stack of money. Chapter 9. Constance. It isn't that I didn't like people. It's that I didn't like when there were lots of people in the same room at the same time. But what I disliked even more than a large group of people was a large group of people panicking in the pitch black. My dancing partner was holding me close still, and I discovered I was holding him back, my hands gripping his arms tightly. He didn't seem afraid or concerned. In fact, he laughed a little. "Well, now this is fun," he said, but when I didn't respond, his tone changed. It became softer. "Are you all right?" There was a crash from across the room, and a scream. I knew instantly that the crowd was about to turn from a group of nervous individuals to a single entity, like a droplet on a microscope slide, slipping toward and then becoming one with another. Andrew didn't seem to understand the imminent threat, or if he didn't seem to care. I shook my head. It was time to simply take charge. I slid my hand down his arm and took his hand into mine. "Come on," I said with a giggle. He resisted only for a moment, and then allowed me to pull him through the dark. It was something my sisters had taught me. If you want someone to do something for you, ask with a smile or a giggle. I didn't understand why it worked, but it did. I just wanted to ask things normally, but evidently, when I asked things normally, I was too severe. It was surprisingly easy to guide him to the doors, out into the fresh air. I knew the way well enough, and walking with purpose, even in the dark, is an effective way of getting somewhere even if you're a little lost. Even if you are bumping into drunk dancers and panicked waiters. "Where are we going?" he asked, but he didn't sound like he cared about the answer. There was a tinge to his voice that made it sound like he thought the whole experience was adorable. I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I just wanted air. I just wanted air and sky and sea. I just wanted to be away from everyone, from the crowd melting out of the club into the street, from my sister, and yet I held onto his hand, so I supposed, as I pulled him towards the boardwalk, I didn't want to be away from absolutely everyone. I released his hand as I reached out towards the railing, separating the boardwalk from the sandy drop a few feet below. I inhaled the salt. I grabbed onto it tight and closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, inhaling the salt and cold air. I felt suddenly intense memory of that morning, of falling through the wind, of landing in the water, of the chaos, the rushing, the kicking, and trying to find which way was up. I opened my eyes and felt my legs give way, and I crumpled to the ground. I sat, leaning up against a post, breathing hard, staring across the boardwalk at the James Saltwater Taffy Shop, closed and dark. This feeling of dread I've had all day. Something was wrong. I shook my head no. That was a lie. Our emotions lied to us. Nothing was wrong. Everything was quite well. As a matter of fact, you got a gift. You went to a party, and there was a blackout. A very common thing. All is quite well. "You're a gas," said the young man, sitting down next to me. He was out of breath, and I looked at him. Had I been running? I hadn't thought I had been running. My breath came fast and thin, but then it was more about my mind, I thought. Had I been running? Oh, well, I just needed some air, I said. I smiled through. He smiled back. He was having a good time, and I felt relieved. It hadn't mattered that in this moment, I was feeling strange and out of the sorts. He was having a good time, and that was something. Was it, though? "Boy, I'll stay. I'll say," he said, laughing again, turning his whole body to face me. "This ground is freezing. Are you sure you're okay?" No, I was definitely not sure about that. "We should stand up," I said. He gallantly rose and helped me up. It was very nice. I didn't know what to do now that I was standing looking at him, so I turned and faced the ocean once more. "I never get bored of this," I said. There was a waning crescent of a moon that night, like a last farewell of light. Funny to think of it like that. It reflected on the ocean, on the white caps of the waves. I could understand why not. He stood next to me, so that his arm and mine touched. "Do you live here?" I nodded. "I do." "And you're a dancer?" I shook my head. He noticed. "You're not?" I looked at him. "I'm not anything." I felt the return of the strange dark twinge in my gut, but I didn't break eye contact. "That's impossible," he said with a laugh. No, it's very possible. I looked back out to the ocean and saw that then a silhouette on the horizon. Ships came and went with great frequency here, but there was something about this one, just appearing like that out of the night, so late, so secret. I remembered how stories of ships in the 20s bringing alcohol illegally down from Canada, but of course, that was over now. You're definitely a something, a someone, he quickly corrected. You're Constance. I'm Constant, Constant Constance. Yes, that was true. Always reliable. There, there for any situation, like some every day. Household item, like a pair of gardening gloves. I looked at Andrew, and there was nothing else to say or do, so I just smiled. He smiled back. He felt proud. I could tell. He was cheering me up. Or so he thought. His work here was done. He looked down out towards the ocean, content in all his goodness. I looked too. The ship was gone. I will end this off with the start of chapter 10, Bill. I am having a lot of fun reading this, but just let me know down in the comments if you guys are enjoying this too. And if you guys have any suggestions or anything you guys want to talk about, just let me know. I respond to every comment that there is. So, hope you guys have a great night, day, whatever you're listening to. And I hope that you guys have an amazing time. Thank you.